Okay, good afternoon everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's lunch hour lecture. These are really exciting opportunities, I think, to showcase the exciting work that UCL academics do and show the applicability of our research to the world around us. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you today. My name is Jonathan Bell. I'm Professor and Head of Department of the Institute of the Americas here at UCL. And I'm here to introduce today's speaker. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Professor Lee Grieveson, who's Professor of Media History in the Centre for Multidisciplinary and Intercultural Inquiry here at UCL. He's a Professor of Media History and the author of his most recent book, which was published just this year, Cinema and the Wealth of Nations, Media, Capital, and the Liberal World System, published by the University of California Press. But he's also the co-editor and author of a number of other volumes, including Cinema's Military-Industrial Complex, Empire in Film, and a key text in the field, Inventing Film Studies, from Duke University Press. He was also co-director of the funded research project Colonial Cinema Moving Images of the British Empire. Before coming to UCL, he has taught at King's College London and Harvard, and he was made professor here at UCL last year. So today he's going to be talking to us on the subject of on data, media, and democracy. Without further ado, I will hand over to Lee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In elections in the UK and the US in 2016, a bloc of militant liberals and neo-fascists fashioned new media and data practices to smash existing political norms and institutions in order to restructure reality, deconstruct the administrative state, and further hollow out democracy and deregulate capital. Ongoing press, parliamentary, congressional, and legal investigations broadly reveal that political actors reworked the recently established practices of surveillance capitalism to marry the data produced by people in their interactions with social media and the internet to psychographic messaging designed to influence their thoughts and actions. Commercial procedures of data surveillance, such as those integral to the business model of entities like credit rating agency Experian from 1996, multinational search and social media corporations like Google starting in 1999 and Facebook in 2004, were supplemented by practices that had emerged in the governmental sphere in the early years of the digital revolution, when new routines of mass data surveillance were established, like the PRISM program from the slides I'm showing you here from 2007 as part of the expansion of exceptional state practices. In the early 2000s, hybrid governmental consulting institutions began meshing data surveillance with what one of the British entities close to the center of this history, Strategic Communications Laboratories, SCL, called influence operations. There's one more slide about that. Cambridge Analytica, much in the news, of course, recently, grew out of SCL and built on data harvested from Facebook and elsewhere, things like censuses, credit reports, insurance data, and so on, to construct psychological profiles of populations for political campaigns to develop a near-personalized propaganda system using digital screen media to influence political attitudes and conduct. The campaign for Britain to leave the European Union broke electoral laws about spending and collusion to amass this data and use it to deploy media to shape the attitudes of voting populations. Ongoing revelations show, too, that the Russian state fostered digital practices to try to influence people or simply to virally spread confusion via strategies of propagating disinformation that have long been significant to KGB strategies for controlling populations and that are now integral to its successor, the FSB, and military practices in the GRU to use the digital and cybersphere as a component of information warfare to foster state interests. Here, in the case of Russia and Brexit, specifically the weakening of NATO and EU alliances and the rolling back of liberal globalization, a project that has frequently found common cause with fascism. Broadly, then, the influence operations enabled by the meshing of the collection of data about people integral to the digital sphere with media as a form of psychographic messaging or viral distortion were operationalized to transform political reality. Now, I'm going to sketch out just a few fragments from this recent media history here, in part as part of a genealogy of the myriad ways in which media is operationalized to facilitate and sustain exploitative political economies that has gathered pace in the digital era of hyper or militant liberalism, mutating in complex ways into forms of fascism. Let me start with some of the details then. In the early 2000s, a former investment banker who had specialized in financing media called Stephen K. Bannon became a documentary filmmaker, making a number of films like these that argued for what Bannon called the deconstruction of the administrative state, broadly meaning a hollowing out of forms of social democracy that opposed the precepts of liberal globalization in favor of an economic nationalism that segued into ethno-nationalist forms of exclusion and the traditionalism that is significant to current formations of fascism. The films were widely circulated in the new digital spaces in the post-YouTube era and became significant to right-wing, or more accurately, neo-fascist, excuse me, I lost my place, more accurately, neo-fascist media networks that grew in particular in the early 2000s. Bannon became editor of one of those media entities called Breitbart News, which some of you will have probably heard of, financed by a billionaire investment banker and militant libertarian called Robert Mercer. In 2013, Mercer funded the creation of Cambridge Analytica, and Bannon became its vice president. Cambridge Analytica and Bannon deployed this data media complex in the 2016 election of the former reality television star Donald J. Trump to the position of 45th president of a former colony of this country. Bannon became the campaigns manager and then chief strategist to the administration, which meant that for a time, the two most powerful people in the world were a director of online neo-fascist documentaries and a former reality television star. If nothing else, it should at least make it harder to argue that studying media is a trivial subject. Because, to reiterate, an expanded digital media was deployed as the avant-garde for a militant liberalism bent on stripping back the state that began to merge, as I said, and mutate in complex ways with new strains of fascism. Now, Bannon's films connected to an emergent radical right use of documentary cinema in the post-2005 YouTube era. Close ties were formed by Bannon and Mercer with a conservative action group called Citizens United, who financed films in pursuit of a conservative and religious agenda, as you can see here in a selection of films made by the group. Now, you probably have heard of Citizens United, even if you don't recognize it, because this organization was a plaintiff to an enormously significant legal case that was decided in the Supreme Court in 2010 that basically defined money as speech and voided any restrictions on political spending to influence elections. It is this decision to deregulate campaign finance and enable what Justice John Paul Stevens described in his dissenting opinion as the corporate domination of the electoral process, that is the root of the massive expansion of untraceable dark money in the political system in the US from 2010 onwards. Because of this, extraordinarily wealthy individuals like, for example, the oligarchs Charles and David Koch of Koch Industries or investment banker Robert Mercer were able to funnel enormous sums of untraceable dark money into political campaigns, shaping the turn to a radical libertarian and neo-fascist position from 2010, and indeed then the election of Donald in 2016. Mercer and his daughter Rebecca funded a political action committee called Make America Number One, the same slogan that Trump used just about, that financed parts of Trump's campaign. Bannon and the guy who ran Citizens United, called David Bossie, were parachuted in to run Trump's then floundering campaign. Documentary filmmakers, that is, supplied the fictions that were necessary to convince enough people damaged by the neoliberal deconstruction of the administrative state started under the Reagan administration that the solution to their problems was the further deconstruction of the administrative state marshaled by a tax-dodging property billionaire. I suppose documentary filmmakers have always been good at what Trump's media manager called alternative facts, or what John Grierson, when he came up with the term documentary, described as the creative treatment of actuality. Indeed, there is a further twist to this quite extraordinary story, I think, because the extraordinarily significant Citizens United versus Federal Electoral Commission decision was actually made about this movie, the decision that enabled the complete massive expansion of dark money was made about this movie that was produced by Citizens United in 2008 as part of a long-term campaign against the Clintons as key actors in the expansion of liberal globalization. Now, back now to Mercer and Screen Media, the banker who earns about $135 million a year also financed an organization called the Government Accountability Institute, run by Bannon and a guy called Peter Schweizer, who collaborated to make this movie in 2016 called Clinton Cash by the film production Glittering Steel that was run by Bannon and financed by Mercer. So here is a glimpse of the Freedom of Information requests that document the movement of money from Mercer to Glittering Steel. Here how much the Political Action Committee spent in the 2016 election cycle. And here are some of the moving image attack ads that Glittering Steel made, Bannon and Glittering Steel made. Cash turned into media that was widely shared through digital networks to shape the public sphere. Clinton Cash, the movie, was co-produced by Rebecca Mercer, Robert Merson's daughter, and it directly accuses the fabulously wealthy Clintons of wielding their influence secretly for financial gain. Now, digital networks became crucial to an emergent radical right and neo-fascist media network that began to flourish in the early 2000s, notably from 2003, when the message board 4chan was created, and which picked up pace from the Mercer-funded expansion of Breitbart News from 2007, and further in the post-2008 economic crash era, when Bannon and Citizens United accelerated film production and circulated them online, and when a number of neo-fascist website and media entities emerged and flourished, including the Daily Stormer, VDare, Radix, and American Renaissance, and others. The creation of a neo-fascist and libertarian media network filtered into the mainstream through connections in particular with the News Corp-owned Fox News, often through guests who were, whoops, I think I went too far there. Often through guests who were employed by a network of think tanks and front groups that have been established by these libertarian groups, for example, people like Charles and David Koch, to shape the public sphere. The Koch brothers and other billionaire supporters have spent enormous sums of money over time, from the 1970s in particular onwards, funding and creating think tanks, focus groups, political parties, university departments, and so on, to shape the public sphere, a subject explored in part in recent journalism and scholarship, including Nancy MacLean and Jane Mayer's great book, Dark Money. Here, for example, are people employed in those ideological think tanks who then espouse their opinion on mainstream news reports. Over time, the Mercer-financed and Bannon-edited Breitbart became a crucial node in this media network, as this image created by Jonathan Albright to track the digital circulation of right-wing propaganda shows. Breitbart linked an emerging neo-fascist media network together, helping spread emotionally charged disinformation and propaganda as part of a militantly liberal effort to strip back government in terms of things such as social welfare for the disadvantaged and taxation of the wealthy. For the beleaguered billionaires of the Koch ring, the question of taxation as an example of government overreach trampling on liberty is, surprise, surprise, a recurrent subject, as it is, of course, for Donald himself, who has refused to reveal his tax returns that would show the methods by which he has successfully avoided paying taxes. But then, of course, tax avoidance, to minimize contributing to the general public good while amassing extraordinary private wealth, is central to the global financial system, rooted through a network of tax havens located mostly in former imperial territories that are used by the wealthy, like the Koch brothers and Mercer, to hide their wealth, as well as a number of members of Trump's cabinet, as revealed both in the Panama and the Paradise Papers, even including, if you could imagine it, our own unelected head of state. Though, to be fair to the extraordinarily wealthy, freeloading, landowning royals, that is also true of other heads of state in equally undemocratic states like China and Russia, as well as corporations like, for example, these. The Tax Justice Network estimates that there is somewhere between $24 to $36 trillion unreported in tax havens. If this money was taxed, perhaps, just for example, our students would not be paying for their education. Now, bear with me just a little while longer as I pursue this recent history of the enmeshing of political, economic, and media power before I will draw some conclusions from it. Because these conservative and libertarian networks to weaponize media were supplemented by new digital strategies to use data to micro-target propaganda that in turn mutated into the production and amplification of fake news and alternative facts as part of the broader campaign of misinformation that is essential to this libertarian and neo-fascist project. One of the key institutions here, as I mentioned, was created by Mercer and Bannon in 2013, and which had spun out of the British company SCL. Note they were using probably the same PR agents as UCL were at this point in time. They got better later. Theirs got better later. They were loaded, and I suppose UCL isn't. SCL was founded by a former advertising executive to use behavioral science in what they called influence operations. It is basically a psychological operations organization which is hired at great expense by dubious state actors to shape media and propaganda and perception to influence people. Cambridge Analytica emerged from this organization then with capital from Mercer and began buying up enormous amounts of data about people from data brokers like Axiom and Experian and new media entities like Facebook, and began to correlate this data with well-known, well-established techniques of personality profiling. The current slide shows the company's former CEO explaining how this works in a talk pitch to gain business for the company. Here is more detail on the well-known OCN personality profiling the company used. The idea was based on research carried out by a PhD student in the Psychometric Center at the University of Cambridge, who had shown that social media posts, including in particular the things that people like on Facebook, and Facebook introduced this feature in 2009 specifically to extract more data about people. So if you liked a number of things on Facebook, this PhD researcher suggested that it could accurately predict your personality type using the personality profiling, as well as a host of simpler things, like, for example, your gender, your sexuality, your political orientation. So Cambridge Analytica basically stole this research and correlated the data they were buying and harvesting from Facebook, in particular with personality profiles, enabling them, they claimed, to amass about 50,000 data points on each person in the US and to precisely target people in crucial swing states who might be susceptible to particular messages. Now, behavioral science had showed simply that angry people are more likely to click on links and ads and share them. And this became central to the purposeful production and amplification of fake news to amplify anger and division. At the same time, new software was produced that enabled automated fake news videos to be produced on the world's first largest moving image site, YouTube. And these were widely circulated to game algorithms. So pushing this media and these agendas up on lists that people see in their feeds and as suggestions of other things to watch. Quite possibly these films are amongst the very first all-machine-produced digital movies with no actual input from human beings whatsoever. AI-generated films, along with other forms of propaganda and purposefully fake news, were massively amplified by enormous robotic armies which were programmed to push propaganda and fake news through digital networks to game algorithms in an effort, again, to influence people and, if nothing else, to virally spread distortion and disorder, to create chaos. It seems that most of these bot networks are located in Russia and eastern Ukraine, and they were, as the brilliant Guardian investigative journalist Carol Cadwalla surmises, probably subcontracted by Cambridge Analytica to flood social media and important digital media platforms like YouTube with propaganda and disinformation. One of the remarkable tiny details that emerged after the fact about this particular part of the story is that one of these bot networks had previously been used by the Israeli state to circulate propaganda about its brutally violent, ongoing illegal occupation of Palestinian territories, but it was reprogrammed to circulate propaganda and misinformation for these related interests in enforcing ethno-nationalist definitions of sovereignty. Now, obviously, those of us who lived through the recent European referendum in this country will recognize some of these strategies and developments in, for example, the purposeful effort, excuse me, I went up one slide, running up slides, the purposeful efforts to belittle expertise made by the former Secretary of State for Education, if you can believe it, Michael Gove, who is a graduate of the English program at the University of Oxford. Do note the double emphasis there, please. or in the production of circulation of deliberate misinformation, or in the production of deplorable neo-fascist dark ads like this, taken from films produced by Leave EU campaign and circulated in particular on Facebook, targeted directly to a person's newsfeed and thereafter disappearing. One of the reasons for this recognition is that the Leave EU campaign too used Cambridge Analytica and spent money illegally in the final months of the campaign to produce digital propaganda and misinformation to influence a political decision of some use to venture capitalists, to the neo-fascist ideologues of sovereignty and ethno-nationalism, and seemingly to the geopolitical ambitions of the Russian state. Now, considerable sums of money to produce media to try to influence people was spent by a shady businessman and mostly failed capitalist called R.M. Banks, who bankrolled the UK Independence Party and parts of the Leave EU campaign, though it's entirely unclear how he came to have so much money to do so, even despite the brilliant, detailed investigative reporting of a number of journalists. The plot thickens a tiny bit here, though, because this guy Banks, who financed most of the Leave EU campaign, is married to a Russian woman who has been investigated for spying by the British services and whose father is a senior Russian state official, and Banks himself lied consistently throughout the referendum about the meetings that he was taking with the Russian embassy. In any case, wherever this money comes from, and clearly it's Russia, but you didn't hear it from me, some of it was invested in this film, slickly produced, and widely circulated to over 2 million people on YouTube and other digital networks in the run-up to a referendum that was decided by 600,000 votes. Brexit, the movie, made with dark money, is suffused in nostalgia for Britain's imperial past. And one of its central arguments is that leaving the EU will allow Britain to strip out all of the regulations, like, for example, on environmental law, that is a brake on the circulation of capital. And clearly one can see connections here with libertarian ideas about meddlesome social democracy getting in the way of freedom. Albeit, of course, quite incoherently, given that this freedom required secretive funds from who knows where, really Russia, to produce propaganda and to harvest ever more data about people. But then coherence and logic are no longer a prerequisite for the discourses and practices that shape our world. Evidently then, dark money from financiers, probably Russia, probably, and certainly neo-fascist supporters, and the three of those things are often intertwined, sluiced through our media system to enable the production and micro-targeting of propaganda as part of an expansive digital psychological operations. Both the Brexit and the Trump campaigns to use media and data to destroy reason and hack democracy modeled a toxic mix of neo-fascist ideas about tradition, sovereignty, of the necessity of murderous borders, keeping out racialized others, many of whom, of course, have been devastated by the various legacies of imperialism, civil wars, and the emerging realities of climate change, whilst further enabling the speeded up and accelerated movement of capital. People cannot move, but capital can. Here, to make you annoyed, is a picture tweeted by the former commodities trader Nigel Farage, who led the Leave EU campaign and who is friends with the bankers Mercer and Bannon, of Nigel with Donald the day after Donald's surprising election victory in the gold-plated lift that services Donald's gold-plated apartment in Trump Tower. But to help my argument, I have taken the picture from the free right-wing propaganda that is given out every evening in this city. It is free because it is monetized by selling your attention to advertisers who want to influence you. That is also a good example of media being used to foster pro-business policies in this one of the financial centers of the world, and indeed of the complex enmeshing of media and political power that I've been in part talking about, given that the Evening Standard is now edited by the former Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer and champion of austerity, George Osborne, when he is not, that is, spending time as a visiting fellow at the Koch oligarch-financed Hoover Institution at Stanford University. But if you pull out from the picture that I showed you moments ago, and the image was used widely in the press, you see that the two of them are actually surrounded by a bunch of other people, including Aaron Banks, the shady, failed capitalist who had money from who knows where to influence Leave EU, some of which was spent on Brexit the movie. Strange times. Now, one or two simple conclusions can be drawn from this whirlwind tour through some of these recent developments in the intertwined history of political and economic ordering and media, and the intensification of this radical liberalism as it mutates into forms of fascism. One of them is simply that the control and shaping of media forms and systems are essential to how power, as, and I'm quoting from Manuel Castells, the relational capacity that enables a social actor to influence asymmetrically the decisions of other social actors operates. Now, I have sketched out some concrete examples of that process where media, in some of the expanded ways that I've been talking about today, is directly used to try to influence people the way they think and act, particularly in terms of a freeing of imperializing, globalizing capital and the scaling back of forms of social democracy. Now, by any number of metrics, an expanded, convergent digital media has become ever more central to our lives. Kids, for example, spend an average of 6 hours a day looking into screens. Your smartphone is touched on average 2,600 times a day. New hybrid forms of digital media and telecommunications and technology have become ever more significant to our post-industrial economy, so that by 2015, 3 out of the 5 largest US corporations were Apple, Google, and Microsoft. 6 large global corporations own roughly 80% of the media that circulates through these networks. This slide is no longer entirely accurate, but it's indicative. And tech hybrids like Google, Facebook, and Apple wield extraordinary monopoly power. Obviously, our world is increasingly mediatized, such that it is firstly ever more filtered through the optic of a media system, and secondly, that becomes more and more profoundly embedded in the fabric of our everyday life. Okay, I'm near the end now, I promise. So, both the militant liberal and neo-fascist project to reshape political, economic, and social reality relied then necessarily on media, and it flourished in particular in the digital revolution of information communication and media systems that gathered pace around the turn of the millennium. Broadly speaking, new digital spaces and networks emerged outside of the existing corporate control media system, and these became important to groups bent on challenging the liberal consensus, be those fascist or militantly liberal. But this shift from a controlled corporate liberal model of broadcasting and print journalism, with muted investment in ideas of objectivity and expertise, to a new digital media sphere of participation, opinion, and algorithmically driven content, brought with it a radical disruption of reigning epistemological norms. And the clearest example of this is in the phenomenon of what started to be called fake news or alternative facts to generate capital by people clicking on it, principally for those new digital media entities, or by interested actors like, for example, the Russian state, simply to spread distortion and disinformation and disable effective action. Now, it's worth noting, in passing as it were, that these practices of disinformation to transform political realities enabled by the broad transformation of media systems were operationalized by other state actors too for varying goals. One of the key threads here, tragically, has been the denial of anthropogenic climate change. essential to the continuity of extractive fossil fuel industries. Radical libertarian oligarchs Charles and David Koch, for example, have long used extraordinary amounts of capital to fund research that doubts the overwhelming conclusions of climate science, as well as buying the politicians happy to disable effective regulation, defeating clean air regulation, pulling out the Paris Climate Accords, and those kinds of things. Climate scientists, in contrast, and you will have seen the UN report last week, I suppose, assert that delaying responding to climate change will usher in the end of organized human society. But clearly, the truth of climate change gets in the way of the profits of carbon capital, indeed of the continuity of a globally expansive, extractive capitalist system. Obviously, this then must be doubted, as Naomi Klein, amongst others, has argued. But obviously then, the strategic destruction of reason and the disabling of the distinctions between facts and fiction, long significant to fascism, was boosted by the epistemological shift of the digital and marshaled by militant liberals and neo-fascists alike to further deconstruct the ability of the state to regulate capital, and by others to weaken the ideas and practices of democracy, even in its attenuated liberal iteration, in the midst of a turn to authoritarian governance in a number of states in the late neoliberal period. One final simple conclusion to be drawn from some of this history is simply this: media is essential to how power functions and to the sustenance of a political economy driven by the interests of capital that is accelerating in ways that are irrevocably damaging to people and our shared habitats. But yet, the study of media remains the most derided discipline in the humanities, perhaps even the university as a whole, a clear sign always of the dumbing down of the academy. But clearly, one offshoot of the arguments I've been making here is that the study of media ought to be thought of as foundational for the university today in our era of deep mediatization, particularly as these institutions too experience the sharp edges of a militant liberalism and the ongoing efforts to deconstruct the administrative state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that very stimulating talk. We do have time for a couple of questions, but I'm very, very conscious of time. So there are microphones, and I'm going to ask, if you do want to ask a question, can you wait for the microphone to come and just keep it as to the point as you possibly can, so that we can have a discussion, but also there's another lecture starting at 2 o'clock, so I'm just conscious of time. So shall we start here and then there?
You mentioned the disreputable image that media studies might have within the academy and general. Do you think, the question, that it might be better to drop separate departments of media studies and just have a basic study within politics and political science about power and how it's mediated?
I don't have a good answer to that. I certainly think that the second thing that you said should happen. I'm not sure that we need to stop having media programs and departments in order for the second thing to happen. I mean, politics, historians, people in political science, people in public policy, people in these disciplines that tend not to think very much about media probably ought to think about media more carefully than they do.
There's a gentleman in the middle.
Thanks for the talk. I'm a documentary maker, so feeling a bit bruised by the attack collectively, not me personally. As a documentary maker, and I guess more broadly as citizens, what can we do, to counter all the scary things you've said?
Okay, so how long do we have? I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, there's policy things that one can be talking about and dealing with, and there are ongoing policy debates about what we should do about these massive entities like Facebook and so on. But generally what we should do is have a revolution. That's the only solution. That's the solution. We can do policy things and that'll be okay, but what really needs to happen is to radically transform the way our world works. Otherwise, we're all, going to get too hot.
Questions?
Let's probably put a kibosh on questions. Sorry, folks. Cheerful lunch hour. Hank.
Well, that's kind of positive. I mean, that's a positive answer.
Yeah.
I think.
Revolution is the answer.
Yeah. One more question.
It's kind of specific question. The chap you mentioned, Peter Schweitzer.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about his background?
I don't really know very much about him. I know he wrote the book Clinton Cash, and he was financed by Mercer in doing so, but I don't know much about what he was before that. I suspect he was a journalist, do you?
Well, I don't know. That's why I asked the question, because this relates to your pet hate about advertising. I knew Peter Schweitzer, who was the worldwide chairman of J. Walter Thompson Advertising.
Seriously?
Yeah, he's Peter Schweitzer.
Is it the same Peter Schweitzer?
I don't know. That's why I was asking whether you knew. But you talk about corporations. Sorry, as you know, advertising is a thing with me. There are now only 5 corporations who own all of the advertising communication companies in the world.
Really?
Yeah. Well, Martin Sorrell, is WPP. He just got kicked out for being a naughty boy. He was the head of one of them, which is WPP. Then there's Interpublic, and there's Publicis, a French one. 2 Americans, I think. 2 Americans, 2 British, and 1. I think. So, in the same way as you're talking about the corporations.
Yeah. It's a sort of logic of how that particular form of capital works. It tends to produce oligopoly ultimately, and that's what happens in the major studio systems, as some of my students and I've been talking about, but it happens here and it happens there.
They all used to be private, of course. That's why they've got the names of people like J. Walter Thompson, Leo Burnett.
Yeah.
But now, of course, they're all public.
Yeah.
Become public, and, as you say.
And one last question down here, and then we'll.
Yeah. Lee, after the lecture, I feel so great uncertainty and unsafety because it seems that we are living in such kind of world flooded with all the fake news of unreal things. So I just want to ask one personal question. As a public member, how could we protect our safety and to distinguish from the real and the false? Any suggestion?
It's a good question, and I don't really have a very good answer. I mean, a lot of you are younger than me, so you're probably part of social media. Well, that's a big mistake, personally. Don't be, I guess. Don't be. Delete Facebook, I suppose, would be one of the solutions. Then I don't know how to help you, I'm afraid. I don't have a good answer. It's extremely difficult in the digital world that we live in to discern the differences between truth and falsity anymore, and that's precisely what was part of this narrative. That's precisely what happened, and that difficulty needs to be. Is it possible to transform that difficulty? I don't know.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, on that note of uncertainty, I think it's given us a lot to think of about. I'd like to thank you all for coming and joining us at the lecture, and please join me in thanking Professor Grieveson. Thank you.